Master William Ashford's mysterious illness began in March 1839, with symptoms so subtle that no one noticed anything wrong for weeks. The wealthy Alabama plantation owner complained of occasional stomach discomfort, mild headaches, and fatigue that he attributed to the stress of managing 800 acres and 63 enslaved workers. By June, he could barely leave his bed, his body wasting away despite the best efforts of 3 different physicians who prescribed treatments that seemed to make him worse rather than better. William died in August, his death attributed to an unknown disease that had baffled medical science. No one suspected that his trusted house slave, Moses Turner, who had carried water from the plantation well to the main house twice daily for 12 years, had been slowly introducing substances into that water supply that mimicked natural mineral contamination while delivering cumulative doses of something far more deadly. What drove a man known for his gentle demeanor to commit such calculated, patient murder? And how did he ensure the poison affected only his intended target while leaving everyone else who drank from the same well unharmed? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. But Moses Turner's knowledge of water and its properties extended far beyond the simple task of drawing it from a well and delivering it to the main house. He had been born near a swamp in 1807, growing up in an environment where water was both sustainer of life and bringer of death depending on its source and quality. His mother, a woman named Sarah who had survived 43 years of enslavement before dying when Moses was 14, had taught him which standing water was safe to drink and which would bring fever and sickness. She had explained how certain plants growing near water could leach their properties into the liquid, how minerals from different soils created waters with different tastes and effects. That early education had been expanded through 12 years of managing the Ashford plantation's water supply, during which Moses had observed how different people reacted to water drawn from different depths of the well, how seasonal changes affected the water's mineral content, and most importantly, how small additions of certain substances could alter water's chemistry without creating obvious changes that would alert drinkers to contamination. The year was 1839, and the Ashford plantation occupied 800 acres of rich Alabama bottomland, where cotton grew in fields that stretched toward horizons broken only by stands of pine and cypress. The main house stood on a gentle rise that provided commanding views of the property, a 2-story structure built from brick fired in kilns that enslaved workers had constructed and operated. Behind the main house, perhaps 200 yards distant, stood the plantation well Moses's domain and the source of the household's water supply. The well had been dug in 1820 by the elder William Ashford, father of the current master, who had hired professional well diggers to ensure the structure would provide abundant clean water for decades. The well descended 60 feet through clay and limestone before reaching an underground source that produced cold, clear water even during the driest summers. A wooden frame structure covered the well's opening, with a rope and pulley system that allowed buckets to be lowered and raised with relative ease. The surrounding area was kept meticulously clean, with drainage channels that prevented surface water from contaminating the well's opening. Moses Turner had been purchased by the elder Ashford in 1823, when Moses was 16 years old, and already showing the quiet competence that would define his adult life. The young enslaved man had been assigned initially to field work, but his careful attention to detail and his ability to follow complex instructions had caught the attention of the plantation's overseer. Within 2 years, Moses had been transferred to household duties, where his responsibilities included maintaining the water supply for the main house. The task seemed simple enough: draw water from the well twice daily, morning and evening, and deliver it to various locations throughout the house where it would be stored in ceramic jugs for drinking, cooking, and washing. But Moses quickly learned that the work required more sophistication than it initially appeared. Different family members had preferences about their water. Some wanted it drawn from specific depths, where it tasted slightly different due to mineral variations. Others insisted on water that had been allowed to settle for several hours to remove any cloudiness. Moses studied these preferences carefully, understanding that attention to such details was what separated enslaved workers who were valued from those who were merely tolerated. He learned to identify subtle differences in the water based on how deep he lowered the bucket, noting that water from 40 feet had a slightly sweeter taste than water from 50 feet, and that the deepest water at 60 feet carried a mineral tang that some people preferred, while others found unpleasant. Over the years, Moses developed what amounted to expertise in water management that extended well beyond what his enslavers understood. He observed that water quality varied with seasons. Spring rains would sometimes introduce cloudiness that required additional settling time, while late summer produced the clearest, coldest water. He noticed that certain weather patterns affected the well's output, with dry spells lowering the water level and changing its taste slightly as different mineral layers became exposed. Most importantly, Moses learned through careful experimentation which substances could be added to water without creating obvious changes in appearance, taste, or smell. This knowledge came initially from innocent causes. He discovered that certain leaves falling into water buckets would slightly alter the taste, but wouldn't be noticed if the concentration was low enough. He found that minerals from different soils, when dissolved in tiny amounts, could change water's properties in ways that most people wouldn't detect unless they were paying very close attention. This accumulated knowledge sat unused in Moses's mind for years, simply part of the expertise he had developed in performing his assigned duties. He had no particular grievance against the Ashford family during those early years, or at least no grievance that seemed worth the catastrophic risk of acting against them. The elder William Ashford had been neither exceptionally cruel nor unusually kind. He treated his enslaved workers as property to be managed efficiently, with punishments for infractions, but also recognition of good work through small privileges. When the elder Ashford died in 1831 and his son William inherited the plantation, Moses initially saw little change in his daily routine. The younger William was 25 years old at the time of his inheritance, newly married to a woman named Margaret, who came from a wealthy, mobile family. For the first several years, William seemed to follow his father's example in plantation management, maintaining established routines and keeping the same overseer and work assignments that had made the property profitable. Moses had married in 1828, choosing a woman named Hannah who worked in the plantation's weaving house, producing cloth for the enslaved workers' clothing. Their wedding had been a simple ceremony permitted by the elder Ashford, followed by permission to share a cabin in the quarters behind the main house. Hannah gave birth to their first child, a son they named Jacob, in 1824. A daughter named Ruth followed in 1826, and another son named Samuel in 1829. The family's relative stability was unusual for enslaved people and depended entirely on William Ashford's willingness to keep them together, rather than selling individuals when cash was needed. That stability, which Moses had worked 12 years to maintain through reliable service and careful avoidance of anything that might give Ashford reason to separate the family, shattered completely in February 1839 when gambling debts forced William to make brutal business decisions that would seal his own fate. Moses understood by then that his value to the household lay not just in his work, but in the trust he had cultivated, trust that made him practically invisible as he moved through the main house twice daily carrying water that sustained the very lives of the people who claimed to own him. That trust would become the foundation of the most patient murder ever committed on an Alabama plantation, a killing so gradual and so perfectly disguised as natural illness that even the most skilled physicians of the era would never suspect that William Ashford was being systematically poisoned by the loyal servant who brought him water to drink while he slowly died. Moses's transformation from patient servant to calculating killer began on a cold February morning in 1839, when William Ashford summoned him to the main house study for a conversation that would change everything. Moses entered the book-lined room with the careful deference he had perfected over 16 years of enslavement, keeping his eyes appropriately downcast while waiting for his master to speak. Ashford sat behind his mahogany desk, papers spread before him in patterns that suggested financial distress, a half-empty whiskey bottle visible despite the early hour. "I need to discuss plantation business with you, Moses," Ashford began, his voice carrying the strained quality of a man facing problems he couldn't solve through authority alone. "I've made some investments that haven't paid off as expected, and I find myself needing to raise capital quickly." The words were euphemisms for gambling losses, though Ashford maintained the fiction that his financial difficulties stemmed from legitimate business ventures rather than cards and dice. Moses stood quietly, understanding that enslaved people summoned for such conversations rarely heard good news. Ashford continued without waiting for response. "I've arranged to sell several workers to a plantation in Mississippi. The prices offered are fair, and the buyers have assured me the workers will be treated well." More euphemisms, more lies designed to make brutal economics sound like reasonable business decisions. "Your son Jacob is among those being sold," Ashford said finally, the words dropping like stones into the silence Moses maintained through sheer force of will. "He's 15 now, strong and healthy, and he'll bring a good price. The sale is finalized. The buyer arrives tomorrow to take possession." Ashford spoke as if discussing livestock rather than a teenager being torn from his family, his tone suggesting he expected Moses to accept this news with the same resignation that characterized most enslaved people's responses to such catastrophes. Moses forced himself to remain still, to keep his expression neutral, to give no indication of the rage that exploded through his chest with such force that he briefly couldn't breathe. Ashford was selling Jacob, his son, the bright boy who had been learning carpentry, and who represented Moses's hope that at least one of his children might develop skills valuable enough to ensure slightly better treatment. That son was being sold to Mississippi, to cotton country where enslaved people died young from brutal labor and conditions that made Alabama seem merciful. "I understand, Master Ashford," Moses heard himself say, the words emerging automatically from years of practiced submission. "Will Jacob be allowed to say goodbye to his family before he leaves?" The question was all Moses would permit himself, knowing that showing too much emotion would be interpreted as insolence and might result in punishment or the sale of additional family members. "Brief goodbyes this evening," Ashford allowed, apparently satisfied that Moses was accepting the situation appropriately. "But don't let it become a scene. I won't tolerate disruption over a necessary business transaction." He waved dismissal, already turning his attention back to the papers on his desk. Moses forgotten the moment he was no longer immediately useful. Moses left the study and returned to his cabin, moving through familiar spaces while his mind worked through implications and possibilities. That evening, Jacob came to say goodbye to his parents and siblings, the teenager trying to be brave while tears streamed down his face. Moses held his son and memorized his features, understanding with terrible certainty that this would be the last time they would see each other. Mississippi cotton plantations consumed young men like Jacob, working them to death within 5 years on average. Hannah wept openly, holding Jacob while their younger children clung to their brother and cried without fully understanding why he was leaving. Moses watched his family's anguish and felt something inside himself turn cold and hard, transformation from victim to person capable of murder, crystallizing in those moments as he said goodbye to his eldest son. William Ashford would pay for this separation, not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably and fatally. The next morning, Moses watched from a distance as Jacob was loaded into a wagon with 3 other enslaved workers Ashford had sold, all of them chained despite having committed no crimes beyond being valuable enough to pay their master's gambling debts. The wagon departed toward the west, carrying Moses's son away to a fate that was essentially a death sentence, delivered slowly through brutal labor and inhuman conditions. Moses returned to his duties that same day, drawing water from the well and delivering it to the main house with the same quiet efficiency he had demonstrated for 12 years. But as he lowered the bucket into the well's depths and pulled it back up, filled with cold, clear water, Moses began planning how that water would become the weapon that killed William Ashford so slowly and subtly that no one would ever suspect murder. The planning required patience that matched the grief Moses felt over Jacob's loss, both emotions compressed into determination so intense it sustained him through the months that followed. He couldn't act immediately or obviously. Any sudden change in William Ashford's health following Jacob's sale would invite scrutiny that might expose Moses's role. Instead, Moses needed to create an illness that developed gradually over months, symptoms that would appear to be natural disease, progressing through predictable stages toward an inevitable conclusion. Moses began by reviewing everything he knew about water and contamination, knowledge accumulated through years of observation and experimentation. He understood that certain minerals occurred naturally in water depending on its source and the geology it passed through. Iron made water taste metallic and could stain fixtures orange. Sulfur created a distinctive rotten egg smell. Limestone contributed calcium that made water hard and left white deposits. These natural variations were well known and considered normal, even desirable in some cases. But Moses also knew about substances that occurred in nature, but that became toxic when concentrated or consumed regularly over time. He had observed how water standing in copper vessels would sometimes make people ill with stomach complaints if left too long. He had seen how certain plants growing near the swamp where he was born would poison livestock that drank from contaminated pools. Most importantly, he had learned through careful attention to local gossip about wells that had been abandoned because they made people sick, contamination blamed on minerals or underground sources that introduced harmful substances. The challenge Moses faced was introducing contamination that would affect only William Ashford, while leaving everyone else in the household safe. The plantation well provided water for the entire main house, including Margaret Ashford and her 3 children, as well as the enslaved house servants who drank from the same source. Moses couldn't poison the entire well without killing people he had no quarrel with, and without creating obvious evidence that something was wrong with the water supply. The solution came to Moses during his 3rd week of planning, while he was drawing morning water and thinking about the different preferences various family members had expressed over the years. William Ashford always wanted his personal drinking water drawn from the well's deepest point at 60 feet, claiming it tasted colder and purer than water from shallower depths. He kept a ceramic pitcher in his study and another in his bedroom, both of which Moses refilled daily with water drawn specifically for the master's personal use. This preference created an opportunity for selective poisoning. Moses could draw 2 buckets each morning, one from 60 feet for William's personal supply and one from 40 feet for general household use. The bucket intended for William could receive additions of contaminating substances after being drawn, but before being delivered, while the bucket for general use would remain pure. The system required Moses to mark one bucket in a way that only he could identify, ensuring he never confused which water went where. Moses selected a bucket that had a small crack in its wooden rim, damage barely visible, but that he could identify by touch, even in darkness. That bucket would always be used for William's personal water supply. The other bucket, completely intact, would provide water for everyone else. With this system in place, Moses could introduce contaminants, knowing they would reach only his intended target. The next question was what substance to use for the actual poisoning. Moses needed something that would accumulate in William's body over time, creating progressive illness that doctors would attribute to natural disease rather than deliberate contamination. The substance needed to be available without arousing suspicion, needed to dissolve in water without creating obvious changes in appearance or taste, and needed to produce symptoms consistent with known illnesses. Moses found his answer in the swamp that bordered the western edge of the Ashford plantation, the same swamp where he had learned about water as a child. Growing in the shallow pools and muddy banks were several plants that Moses's mother had warned him were poisonous to livestock and humans alike. One plant in particular, which grew thick leaves covered with fine hairs, was known to cause wasting illness in animals that ate it. The plant's toxin was a heavy metal that accumulated in organs over time, progressively damaging the liver and kidneys until they failed. Moses began harvesting small amounts of this plant during his rare free hours, collecting leaves that he would dry carefully and then grind into powder, using a stone and mortar he kept hidden in the woods. The powder could be dissolved in water, creating a solution that was colorless and nearly tasteless if diluted sufficiently. Moses experimented with different concentrations, adding tiny amounts to water he saved from his own rations, and observing how much could be added before taste became noticeably different. He settled on a dosage so small that William would never detect it, perhaps a quarter teaspoon of powder dissolved in a full bucket of water. That amount would provide negligible toxin in any single drink, but consumed twice daily over months. The cumulative effect would be devastating. The heavy metal would accumulate faster than William's body could eliminate it, slowly poisoning his organs in ways that would mimic natural wasting disease. In early March, Moses began his campaign of murder. Each morning when he drew water for William's personal supply, he would add the carefully measured dose of plant powder to the marked bucket after drawing it from the well, but before carrying it into the house. The powder dissolved quickly when stirred, leaving no visible trace in the clear water. Moses would then deliver that contaminated water to William's study and bedroom, refilling the ceramic pitchers that the master used throughout the day. The first week produced no noticeable effects, which was exactly what Moses expected and wanted. The poison needed to accumulate gradually, building up in William's body before symptoms would appear. Moses continued his routine with the same quiet efficiency he had always displayed, giving no indication that anything had changed beyond the grief he was permitted to show over Jacob's sale. By the end of March, William began complaining of occasional stomach discomfort and mild headaches, symptoms so common and minor that no one attributed them to anything more serious than stress or dietary indiscretion. Moses noted these complaints without comment, continuing his daily routine while watching carefully for signs that the poisoning was progressing as planned. April brought more pronounced symptoms that began to concern Margaret Ashford, enough that she suggested her husband consult their family physician. William dismissed her worries initially, insisting that minor discomfort wasn't worth the expense and inconvenience of summoning Dr. James Crawford from town. But as the stomach problems persisted and were joined by increasing fatigue that made even simple tasks feel exhausting, William reluctantly agreed to be examined. Dr. Crawford arrived in late April, a middle-aged physician who had practiced medicine in Alabama for 20 years and who represented the best medical knowledge available in the region. He examined William thoroughly, asking questions about diet, sleep, and recent changes in routine. The doctor's diagnosis was stomach inflammation, a common ailment he attributed to rich food and the stress of managing a large plantation. He prescribed bloodletting to balance William's humors and recommended a tonic containing mercury, which was standard treatment for various digestive ailments in 1839. Moses watched this medical intervention with concealed satisfaction, understanding that the prescribed treatments would actually worsen William's condition rather than improving it. Bloodletting would weaken an already compromised body, while mercury compounds would add their own toxicity to the heavy metal poisoning Moses was administering. The physician's well-intentioned efforts would accelerate William's decline while providing cover for the true cause of his illness. Through May, William's condition continued deteriorating despite following Dr. Crawford's recommendations faithfully. The stomach discomfort evolved into persistent nausea that made eating difficult. The fatigue deepened until William struggled to complete a full day's work, often retiring to his bedroom in mid-afternoon to rest. His skin took on a grayish pallor that alarmed Margaret, and he began losing weight at a rate that made his clothes hang loosely on a frame that had always been robust and healthy. Moses maintained his routine throughout this decline, delivering contaminated water to William's study and bedroom twice daily while providing pure water to the rest of the household. He observed the master's deterioration with the careful attention of someone monitoring the results of a sophisticated experiment, noting which symptoms appeared when and adjusting his dosage slightly to ensure the progression remained gradual enough to avoid sudden crisis that might trigger investigation. By early June, Margaret insisted on consulting a second physician, her concern overriding William's reluctance to admit he needed additional medical help. Dr. Henry Whitmore arrived from Mobile, a younger doctor who had studied at medical school in Philadelphia and who brought more current knowledge than Crawford possessed. Whitmore conducted an extensive examination, testing William's urine for signs of kidney disease and examining his tongue and eyes for indicators of liver problems. His diagnosis was more sophisticated than Crawford's, but ultimately no more accurate. Whitmore concluded William suffered from a wasting disease of unknown origin, possibly related to miasmas from the swamp, or to some constitutional weakness that had only recently manifested. Whitmore's prescribed treatments included various tonics, dietary restrictions that eliminated most meat and required bland foods that would be easier to digest, and complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks. These interventions also failed to improve William's condition because they addressed symptoms rather than the underlying poisoning that continued unabated. Moses delivered contaminated water to the sick room where William now spent most of his time, the master drinking frequently from the pitcher Moses refilled daily, each sip bringing more accumulated toxin into a body whose organs were slowly failing. Through late June and July, William's decline accelerated into what was clearly terminal illness by any medical standard of the era. He could no longer leave his bed without assistance. His weight loss had progressed to the point where bones were visible through wasted flesh, and his mental clarity began deteriorating as toxins affected his brain function. Margaret had given up hope of recovery and focused instead on making her husband's final days as comfortable as possible, though comfort was impossible for someone whose organs were shutting down under the cumulative effects of months of poisoning. Moses continued his patient work, even as William approached death, understanding that stopping too soon might allow partial recovery that would prolong the master's life. The poisoning needed to continue until William died, eliminating any possibility that he might survive long enough for doctors to identify the true cause of his illness. Each morning and evening, Moses carried the marked bucket into the house and refilled the pitcher in William's sick room, the master's dimming consciousness unable to recognize that his most trusted servant was the source of his suffering. The end came in mid-August, when William's kidneys finally failed completely and his body could no longer sustain life. He died on a humid afternoon with Margaret and their children at his bedside, his last coherent words expressing gratitude for Moses's faithful service in bringing him water during his illness. The irony of those final words was lost on everyone except Moses, who received them with appropriate expressions of sorrow while internally acknowledging that justice, however delayed and however achieved, had finally been served. April brought more pronounced symptoms that began to concern Margaret Ashford, enough that she suggested her husband consult their family physician. William dismissed her worries initially, insisting that minor discomfort wasn't worth the expense and inconvenience of summoning Dr. James Crawford from town. But as the stomach problems persisted and were joined by increasing fatigue that made even simple tasks feel exhausting, William reluctantly agreed to be examined. Dr. Crawford arrived in late April, a middle-aged physician who had practiced medicine in Alabama for 20 years and who represented the best medical knowledge available in the region. He examined William thoroughly, asking questions about diet, sleep, and recent changes in routine. The doctor's diagnosis was stomach inflammation, a common ailment he attributed to rich food and the stress of managing a large plantation. He prescribed bloodletting to balance William's humors, and recommended a tonic containing mercury, which was standard treatment for various digestive ailments in 1839. Moses watched this medical intervention with concealed satisfaction, understanding that the prescribed treatments would actually worsen William's condition rather than improving it. Bloodletting would weaken an already compromised body, while mercury compounds would add their own toxicity to the heavy metal poisoning Moses was administering. The physician's well-intentioned efforts would accelerate William's decline while providing cover for the true cause of his illness. Through May, William's condition continued deteriorating despite following Dr. Crawford's recommendations faithfully. The stomach discomfort evolved into persistent nausea that made eating difficult. The fatigue deepened until William struggled to complete a full day's work, often retiring to his bedroom in mid-afternoon to rest. His skin took on a grayish pallor that alarmed Margaret, and he began losing weight at a rate that made his clothes hang loosely on a frame that had always been robust and healthy. Moses maintained his routine throughout this decline, delivering contaminated water to William's study and bedroom twice daily while providing pure water to the rest of the household. He observed the master's deterioration with the careful attention of someone monitoring the results of a sophisticated experiment, noting which symptoms appeared when and adjusting his dosage slightly to ensure the progression remained gradual enough to avoid sudden crisis that might trigger investigation. By early June, Margaret insisted on consulting a second physician, her concern overriding William's reluctance to admit he needed additional medical help. Dr. Henry Whitmore arrived from Mobile, a younger doctor who had studied at medical school in Philadelphia and who brought more current knowledge than Crawford possessed. Whitmore conducted an extensive examination, testing William's urine for signs of kidney disease and examining his tongue and eyes for indicators of liver problems. His diagnosis was more sophisticated than Crawford's, but ultimately no more accurate. Whitmore concluded William suffered from a wasting disease of unknown origin, possibly related to miasmas from the swamp, or to some constitutional weakness that had only recently manifested. Whitmore's prescribed treatments included various tonics, dietary restrictions that eliminated most meat and required bland foods that would be easier to digest, and complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks. These interventions also failed to improve William's condition because they addressed symptoms rather than the underlying poisoning that continued unabated. Moses delivered contaminated water to the sick room where William now spent most of his time, the master drinking frequently from the pitcher Moses refilled daily, each sip bringing more accumulated toxin into a body whose organs were slowly failing. Through late June and July, William's decline accelerated into what was clearly terminal illness by any medical standard of the era. He could no longer leave his bed without assistance. His weight loss had progressed to the point where bones were visible through wasted flesh, and his mental clarity began deteriorating as toxins affected his brain function. Margaret had given up hope of recovery and focused instead on making her husband's final days as comfortable as possible, though comfort was impossible for someone whose organs were shutting down under the cumulative effects of months of poisoning. Moses continued his patient work, even as William approached death, understanding that stopping too soon might allow partial recovery that would prolong the master's life. The poisoning needed to continue until William died, eliminating any possibility that he might survive long enough for doctors to identify the true cause of his illness. Each morning and evening, Moses carried the marked bucket into the house and refilled the pitcher in William's sick room, the master's dimming consciousness unable to recognize that his most trusted servant was the source of his suffering. The end came in mid-August, when William's kidneys finally failed completely and his body could no longer sustain life. He died on a humid afternoon with Margaret and their children at his bedside, his last coherent words expressing gratitude for Moses's faithful service in bringing him water during his illness. The irony of those final words was lost on everyone except Moses, who received them with appropriate expressions of sorrow while internally acknowledging that justice, however delayed and however achieved, had finally been served. Still others told the story more plainly, presenting it as an example of how control over basic necessities like water could be transformed into power when wielded by someone patient and knowledgeable enough to use that control strategically. These varying narratives served important purposes for enslaved people who heard them, providing examples of resistance in a system designed to crush all opposition and offering hope that oppression could be challenged through intelligence and planning, even when direct confrontation meant certain death. The practical information embedded in these stories was perhaps more valuable than their inspirational elements. Enslaved workers who heard about Moses learned that specialized knowledge acquired through forced labor could serve purposes beyond generating profit for masters. A water carrier who understood contamination and mineral content possessed expertise that extended far beyond the simple mechanical task of drawing water from a well. A person trusted with providing basic necessities had access and opportunity that could be exploited if circumstances demanded action that the law would never sanction. This understanding influenced how enslaved people approached the specialized roles they were forced to fill. Cooks paid attention not just to recipes, but to which ingredients could be dangerous if prepared improperly or combined in certain ways. Stable hands learned not just how to care for horses, but which aspects of tack or equipment might fail catastrophically if neglected or subtly damaged. House servants who handled laundry, cleaning, or maintenance understood that the chemicals and tools they worked with daily possessed properties that extended beyond their intended purposes. Margaret Ashford sold the plantation in November 1839 to a buyer from Georgia who planned to expand cotton cultivation and who showed no interest in continuing the horse-breeding operation William had attempted. The sale price was substantial enough to provide Margaret with comfortable income for the rest of her life, and she departed for Mobile with her children shortly after the transaction was completed, leaving behind a property that would look very different under new ownership. Moses, Hannah, and their children left Alabama in December 1839, traveling north along routes established by networks that helped formerly enslaved people relocate to states where their free status would be more secure. They carried their manumission papers carefully protected in oilcloth, understanding that those documents were precious beyond measure in a society where black people were presumed enslaved unless they could prove otherwise. The papers offered protection from slave catchers and gave them legal standing to work, own property, and move freely within the restrictions that still applied to free black people, even in northern states. The family settled eventually in Cincinnati, where a substantial free black community offered both economic opportunities and relative safety from the violence and discrimination that characterized life in slave states. Moses found work with a commercial water company that was beginning to develop the infrastructure for delivering treated water to urban residents, applying knowledge he had developed on the Ashford plantation in a context where he received wages for expertise that had previously generated profit only for white owners. Hannah established a small sewing business, using skills she had developed in the plantation weaving house to create income that contributed significantly to the family's stability. Their daughter Ruth, now 13, helped her mother while also attending a school operated by black churches for children whose parents had escaped slavery. The two sons, Samuel and the younger children born during their first years of freedom, would grow up knowing liberty that their parents had only achieved through extraordinary circumstances. Moses rarely spoke about William Ashford's death to anyone outside his immediate family, maintaining the careful ambiguity that had served him well during the investigation and its aftermath. But occasionally, when talking with other men who had escaped slavery or who had negotiated freedom through various means, he would share observations about how knowledge could become power, how understanding the systems that oppressed you could reveal vulnerabilities to exploit, how patience and subtlety could achieve what direct action never could. These conversations never quite crossed into explicit admission of murder, but they conveyed information that attentive listeners understood clearly. Moses would explain how water could carry minerals that changed its properties, how certain substances dissolved invisibly while others left obvious traces, how accumulation over time could create effects that would never result from single exposures. The practical applications of this knowledge were left unstated, but obvious to anyone who understood what Moses was actually teaching. The well on the former Ashford plantation continued providing water for decades after Moses's departure, serving the new owner and subsequent generations who farmed the property without ever knowing its role in one of Alabama's most perfect murders. The wooden frame structure that covered the well's opening was eventually replaced with a more modern pump system, and later still, the well was abandoned entirely when municipal water systems made private wells obsolete. The exact location of the original well was gradually forgotten as the property changed hands multiple times and as people who remembered the Ashford era died or moved away. Moses Turner lived to age 61, dying in 1868 in the Cincinnati home he had purchased with money earned through his own labor. His funeral was attended by more than 100 people, including family members, fellow workers from the water company, and members of the free black community who had known him as a quiet, dignified man whose past remained partially mysterious despite decades of freedom. The eulogy praised his expertise with water systems and his dedication to family, making only brief reference to his years in slavery and saying nothing specific about the circumstances that had led to his liberation. But among those who attended Moses's funeral were several people who knew the fuller story, who had heard whispered accounts of the master who died from mysterious wasting illness, and the water carrier who had gained freedom as reward for faithful service during that illness. These individuals understood that Moses Turner represented something important in the history of resistance against slavery, an example of how specialized knowledge and trusted access to basic necessities could be transformed into weapons when circumstances demanded action that no legal system would ever sanction or support. The years Moses spent in Cincinnati after leaving Alabama in 1839 had been marked by steady work and gradual accumulation of security that would have been impossible under slavery. The water company that employed him was among the first commercial enterprises attempting to provide treated water to urban residents, recognizing that population growth in cities like Cincinnati required more sophisticated infrastructure than traditional wells and cisterns could provide. Moses's knowledge of water sources, contamination risks, and distribution systems made him valuable to the company's operations, though his wages reflected the reality that free black workers were paid substantially less than white workers performing identical tasks. Despite this wage discrimination, Moses had earned enough over 29 years to purchase a modest house in Cincinnati's free black neighborhood, to provide education for his children that would have been illegal in Alabama, and to save small amounts of money that gave his family cushion against the economic instability that characterized life for most black people in the 19th century. His wife Hannah had contributed significantly to the family's financial stability through her sewing business, which served both black and white customers who valued her skill, even if they wouldn't have socialized with her. Their children had grown into adults during their years of freedom, pursuing opportunities that slavery would have denied them completely. Ruth, the daughter who had been 13 when they left Alabama, had married a carpenter and had 5 children of her own, all born free and educated in schools that black churches operated for their community's children. Samuel, the younger son, had learned the trade of coopering, making barrels and casks, and had established his own small business serving Cincinnati's growing brewing industry. The family's trajectory from enslavement to modest prosperity across a single generation illustrated possibilities that millions of other black families had been systematically denied. The story of Moses and the poisoned water became particularly influential among enslaved people who worked in household positions that required handling food, water, medicine, or other consumables. These workers occupied paradoxical positions within the slavery system. They were trusted with intimate access to their enslavers' daily lives, yet that very trust was born from racist assumptions that enslaved people lacked the intelligence or initiative to exploit such access for harmful purposes. Moses' story demonstrated that those assumptions were catastrophically wrong, and that trust itself could become a vulnerability when placed in people who had every reason to harbor rage against those who enslaved them. The practical lessons embedded in Moses' story were studied carefully by people who found themselves in similar positions. Water carriers learned to pay attention not just to their duties, but to the properties of the water they handled and the substances that might alter it. Cooks and house servants who prepared food or handled medicines understood that their knowledge extended beyond simple task completion into territory that could serve purposes their enslavers never intended. The systematic education in chemistry, botany, and physiology that enslaved workers received through their forced labor could be turned back against the system that demanded that labor. This understanding contributed to an undercurrent of anxiety among Southern white society about the dangers posed by household slaves who prepared food, drew water, administered medicine, or performed other tasks that required trust and access. Plantation owners would occasionally express concerns about poisoning, usually in the context of discussing particularly rebellious or angry enslaved workers. But these concerns rarely translated into systematic precautions, because the logistics of plantation life made it effectively impossible to prevent enslaved workers from having access to consumables. Someone had to draw the water, prepare the food, and handle the medicines, and economic efficiency demanded that those someones be enslaved workers rather than expensive white servants. The result was a system built on contradiction. Enslavers depended absolutely on the labor and cooperation of people they brutally oppressed, creating relationships characterized by simultaneous trust and terror, intimacy and violence. Moses Turner's story illustrated perfectly how that contradiction could become fatal for enslavers who never quite grasped that the people they owned as property were actually human beings capable of sophisticated planning, patient execution, and complete concealment of intentions until far too late for their victims to protect themselves. The broader historical significance of Moses Turner's story extends beyond its specific details to illuminate patterns of resistance that existed throughout slavery, but that were deliberately obscured by both contemporary observers and later historians who found such resistance uncomfortable or inconvenient to acknowledge. The dominant narratives about slavery have often focused on large-scale rebellions, dramatic escapes, or the eventual political movements that led to emancipation, while paying less attention to the countless small acts of resistance that characterized daily life under the system. Moses' story represents this hidden history of resistance actions taken by individuals rather than movements, planned in secret rather than announced publicly, executed through exploitation of specialized knowledge rather than through violence that would invite immediate retaliation. This type of resistance required extraordinary self-control and patience, maintaining submissive appearance while planning and executing actions that completely contradicted every external behavior. It demanded sophisticated understanding of the systems and people being resisted against, recognizing patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited at carefully chosen moments. During his years in Cincinnati, Moses occasionally mentored younger men who had escaped slavery or who had been born free, but who struggled to find their place in a society that granted them legal freedom while denying them genuine equality. He would share observations about how knowledge could become power, how understanding systems revealed vulnerabilities, how patience could achieve what direct confrontation never could. These conversations never explicitly referenced William Ashford's death, but the lessons Moses taught carried clear implications about how enslaved people had found ways to resist, even when resistance seemed impossible. One young man Moses mentored, a former slave named Benjamin who had escaped from Kentucky, later wrote in his memoir about conversations with an older water worker who had taught him that the man who controls what his enemy drinks holds power his enemy cannot see until it is too late to defend against. Benjamin attributed this wisdom to his unnamed mentor without providing details that would identify Moses, But the connection was clear to anyone familiar with the Turner family's history. The ethical complexities of Moses's actions remained unresolved and perhaps unresolvable through simple moral frameworks. He committed murder through a method that was calculated, patient, and completely premeditated actions that any ethical system would recognize as grave violations regardless of context. But he committed that murder within a system that had already committed grave violations against him, a system that had stolen his labor for 16 years, that had claimed ownership of his body and his family's bodies, that had sold his son to near certain death to pay gambling debts. Modern readers struggle with these situations where every available action involves moral compromise. Moses could have done nothing, accepting Jacob's sale as one more horror in a system built on horror. But what parent could make that choice? He could have attempted escape, but the risks of being caught while fleeing with a wife and children were prohibitive, and capture would have meant punishment for the entire family. He could have confronted Ashford directly, but that path led to certain death for Moses and potentially worse consequences for Hannah and their remaining children. The option Moses chose, calculated murder disguised as natural illness, violated fundamental moral principles about the sanctity of human life and the wrongness of taking life through deception. But it also represented one of the few avenues available to an enslaved father desperate to achieve some measure of justice for his son's destruction within a system designed to make such justice impossible through any legitimate means. The moral calculus of such decisions cannot be separated from the moral catastrophe of slavery itself, a system so fundamentally unjust that it created situations where every possible action involved some form of ethical compromise. Hannah Turner, who survived until 1889, occasionally spoke about her husband in interviews conducted by researchers documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences during the decades after emancipation. She never directly confirmed that Moses had deliberately poisoned William Ashford, maintaining the family's careful ambiguity about events from 50 years earlier. But she spoke eloquently about her husband's intelligence, his deep knowledge of water and its properties, and his fierce devotion to family despite the impossible situations slavery created for people trying to protect those they loved. The interviewers who recorded Hannah's testimony came away with clear impressions that Moses had been far more than the simple, loyal servant that official records suggested, though the full truth of what he had done remained tantalizingly just beyond explicit statement. Hannah would describe how Moses had taught their children to pay attention to the natural world, to understand how water moved through soil and rock, to recognize which plants were safe and which were dangerous. These lessons seemed innocent enough on the surface, but they carried implications about knowledge as power, and about how seemingly mundane expertise could serve purposes beyond what enslavers intended or understood. In one particularly revealing interview conducted in 1888, Hannah spoke about the well on the Ashford plantation with a degree of detail that suggested the subject held special significance for her. She described how Moses had maintained that well with meticulous care, how he had understood every aspect of its construction and operation, how he could identify subtle changes in the water's properties based on depth, season, and weather patterns. When the interviewer asked whether Moses had ever suspected that the well might have contributed to William Ashford's fatal illness, Hannah paused for a long moment before responding with careful precision. Moses knew that water could bring both life and death, she said finally. He understood that what sustained you one day might harm you the next, depending on what the water carried and how much you drank. He tried to protect our family from harm in whatever ways he could, using whatever knowledge he possessed. That's all any father could do in those terrible times. The statement was masterfully ambiguous, capable of being interpreted as either innocent observation about water safety or veiled admission that Moses had used his knowledge for purposes his enslavers never suspected. The physical site where the Ashford plantation once stood exists today as part of a much larger commercial agricultural operation, the property having been subdivided and sold multiple times over the 180-plus years since William Ashford's death. The original well that served the main house has long since been filled in and its location forgotten, leaving no visible trace of the structure that served as the delivery system for one of slavery's most perfect murders. The main house itself was destroyed during the Civil War, burned by Union forces moving through Alabama in 1865, and was never rebuilt. Local historians who study the region's antebellum period occasionally mention the Ashford estate in their research, usually in the context of discussing cotton cultivation or the economics of plantation slavery. William Ashford's death from mysterious wasting illness in 1839 appears in these histories as a footnote, sometimes accompanied by speculation about whether the illness might have been cholera or some other disease common in that era. None of these historical accounts seriously consider the possibility that Ashford was murdered by his own slave through months of patient poisoning, because such speculation would require acknowledging that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and the agency to commit such sophisticated crimes. This historical blindness reflects broader patterns in how slavery has been remembered and recorded. The dominant narratives have emphasized enslaved people's suffering and their eventual liberation through political processes controlled by white actors, while paying less attention to the countless ways enslaved people themselves resisted, survived, and sometimes struck back against their oppressors. Moses Turner's story exists in the gaps of official history, preserved through oral tradition and family memory, rather than through documents that contemporary white society would have considered authoritative. The legend of Moses and the poisoned water continued circulating through black communities well into the 20th century, though the details evolved and changed with each generation's retelling. Some versions emphasized the supernatural, claiming Moses had used conjuring or root work to make his master sicken and die. Others focused on the scientific aspects, presenting Moses as a self-taught chemist who had used knowledge of toxicology to commit the perfect crime. Still, others interpreted the story metaphorically, viewing it as a parable about how knowledge and patience could overcome seemingly insurmountable power differentials. All these versions, regardless of their specific details, served similar purposes for the communities that preserved them. They provided examples of resistance and agency in a historical period when black Americans were systematically denied both. They offered evidence that enslaved people had been active participants in their own liberation rather than passive victims waiting for white saviors to free them. And they conveyed practical information about how specialized knowledge could serve purposes beyond those intended by the people who forced enslaved workers to acquire that knowledge. The Turner family maintained their connection to Moses's legacy across multiple generations, though they were careful about how much detail they shared with outsiders. Family gatherings would sometimes include stories about the ancestor who had been a water expert in Alabama before gaining freedom and relocating to Cincinnati. Older family members would emphasize Moses's intelligence and his dedication to family, occasionally adding cryptic comments about how he had used his knowledge to protect the people he loved. Younger generations understood that there was more to these stories than what was explicitly stated, but the family's tradition of careful ambiguity meant that full details were never openly discussed, even within the family itself. This pattern of selective disclosure reflected the ongoing dangers that black Americans faced even after slavery's formal end. During the Jim Crow era, when racial violence and systematic oppression created conditions that in many ways resembled slavery without its legal framework, stories about enslaved people killing their masters could be interpreted as incitement to violence against white people. Families like the Turners understood that preserving their ancestors' story required maintaining the ambiguity that Moses himself had cultivated, never quite confirming or denying the truth about William Ashford's death, even among themselves. Before we end, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The water Moses had used as his weapon continued flowing from countless wells across the south long after his death, sustaining lives that depended on its purity, while occasionally claiming lives when that purity was compromised. The wells that served plantation houses and slave quarters alike represented both survival and vulnerability, sources of life that could become sources of death if the wrong substances entered them, or if the people who controlled them chose to exploit their access for purposes beyond simple service. This duality, water as both sustainer and destroyer, enslaved workers as both trusted servants and potential threats, characterized the fundamental contradictions of slavery itself. The system required enslavers to trust people they brutally oppressed, to depend on people they claimed to own, to grant intimate access to people they systematically dehumanized. These contradictions created vulnerabilities that some enslaved people, like Moses Turner, learned to exploit when circumstances pushed them past the breaking point where survival required action rather than endurance. The well on the former Ashford plantation, now filled and forgotten, kept its secret absolutely. No archaeological investigation has ever been conducted on the site, and no historian has thought to look for evidence of the poisoning that occurred there more than 180 years ago. The water that killed William Ashford has long since flowed away, dispersed into soil and groundwater, and eventually into streams and rivers that carried it to the ocean. The plant Moses used to create his poison still grows in Alabama swamps, its toxic properties unchanged by the passage of time, though few people today would recognize it as the source of death Moses employed so effectively. Moses Turner's story reminds us that history is written not just by the powerful, but also by those who found ways to resist power, who transformed their forced expertise into tools for their own purposes, and who understood that sometimes the longest path to justice begins with the smallest act of contamination, imperceptible to those who drink but cumulative in its effects, until the reckoning can no longer be avoided. The water carrier who knew too much about his craft became the instrument of justice that the law would never provide, and the well that sustained the master's house became his tomb, one bucket at a time, until the debt for a son's destruction was finally paid in full.